Hello everyone and welcome to the .NET Core podcast, the only podcast which is devoted to .NET Core, ASP.NET Core, EF Core, SignalR, and not forgetting the .NET Core community itself. I am your host, Jamie Gaprockman-Taylor, and this is episode 65, What Have I Missed with Zach Braddy. In this episode, Zach actually interviewed me about some of the things that he might have missed in the past few years of .NET innovation. Zach is a full-stack JavaScript developer these days, but started in .NET Framework. We talked about some of the innovations brought about by .NET 5, and whether the CLI tooling for .NET allows developers to work in Vim or Emacs, something that he's very quite interested in. So let's sit back, open up a terminal, type in .NET New Podcast, and let the show begin. So first thing I want to say, Zach, before you take over, is thanks for spending some time this evening with me. And it's the I feel like it's the hottest evening ever, right? I feel like I've been sitting on the surface of the sun, and this never happens in the UK. I'm not complaining, because I've noticed the first thing that happens when people complain about the weather is it then is miserable for the rest of the decade. So I'm not complaining about the weather. I need to make that very clear.
There's so many ways that I could describe how hot it is in Australian, but none of them would allow your podcast to appear on most podcatchers if I did. So I'll just say it's really hot.
It's not particularly pod safe, is it?
No.
Fair enough. Okay. So Zach, for the people listening, Zach and I and fellow podcaster James, the cynical developer, Studart, created a show called Tabs and Spaces, and we decided that we would do an episode of the .NET Core show together. And if you're listening to this, you will more than likely like the Tabs and Spaces, so we'll talk about that in a minute. But before we do any of that, Zach, would you mind kind of introducing yourself? Let the listeners know a little bit about you.
Yeah, absolutely. What I would say as well is if you don't like this episode, you'll probably still like Tabs and Spaces as well. So,
absolutely.
Regardless of what happens right now, let's also give Tabs and Spaces a try.
Oh, of course, yeah.
So, I am currently a JavaScript developer, full stack. I work at a place called Kudu. In a sentence, we're trying to help people save money on their mortgages, which is I feel like it's a bit of a noble cause. I like work. I like being able to help the every person to get somewhere. And prior to me working at Kudu, I was a .NET developer. I was a .NET developer for probably about, I don't know, I mean, who was counting, about 5 or 6 years beforehand. And I'd done things. I've done things in a number of different industries. White labeling. When you've got like supermarkets whose jobs it is not to, they've got all those like home brand sort of things, where it's not their job to manufacture tomato soup, and yet they sell their own branded tomato soup. So the whole thing with the white labeling is that it links up manufacturers with those supermarkets. And tell you what, I'm not going to explain every industry that I've worked in. I've just worked in a lot of them. Yeah. Mainly because I've, throughout my career, I've hopped job to job, and that's allowed me to have a fairly broad experience across a number of different industries, and now a number of different core languages as well. So it's been exciting. I've had a lot of fun.
Awesome. I can totally attest to working in different industries being, I don't know whether better is the right word, but having that experience of working on the other side of the software, using the software, and then taking that to I am now making the software. One of the things I always say to people is, hey, it's primary gifting period. It's Christmas, the end of the year. Try to see what it feels like for the people who are working in the shops. We get it. You want to buy this thing. You've waited until the last minute, but it's not their fault, right? And I honestly think that everyone in the country can deal with, they would be made better if they had 3 or 4 days of working in retail experience to just understand what it's like. And I think using the software that we're making makes you a better person, right? And being in that position where you know those problems, or even just have a little experience of those problems, makes you a better developer, I think.
Yeah, I mean, empathy is a good skill for life, not just development, right? It's
Oh, definitely.
but yeah, as you say, working in lots of different industries and finding lots of different problems that you're trying to solve for people, because you need to not lose sight of that fact when you're building software, right? Ultimately, you're out there trying to make someone's life easier. And that can work both ways, which is also why there's some industries I'll refuse to work in, but maybe that's a story for another time. But you know, it requires a certain level of empathy in order to be able to do well at solving the problems of your domain in each industry that you work in. And I think that helps you learn exactly what you're saying, you know, like, being able to put yourself in the shoes of different people. Absolutely.
And like I say, figuring out empathy, right, is a hell of a drug. Being able to say, instead of just saying the words, I totally understand the problem you're having, actually being able to put yourself in those shoes, right, and say, yes, I get the problem you're having because I've suffered with it too. Let's figure it out together. Let's solve this problem together. Because at the end of the day, that's what we do as developers. We solve problems. We provide solutions to the problems. We don't. Yes, we build software to do that, but I think I've said it in an earlier episode that isn't out at the time that we're recording this, where I've literally said to clients, I could build you the software, but have you tried Excel first?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, this is turning quickly into a Tabs and Spaces episode, and I'm cool with it.
You have to get the editor to throw some sound effects in or something.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so with all of that said, right, what we're actually going to hopefully do is, because Zach's been out of the .NET world for a little while, we're going to turn the tables in a minute, and he's going to basically talk to me about what's so great about .NET these days compared to what was good or not so good about .NET in the past. For a little bit of insider baseball, Zach has provided some questions, and I have basically written out the answers in bullet point form. I'm not going to sit and read them, but they are like notes, kind of like how you would slides, right? So I do know the questions going in, which is something that is always good to do for podcasty things, is to know most of the questions going in. Now, the problem is I've said that, and Zach, I'm sure, is going to throw some curveballs and really completely destroy everything I've just planned.
I'm rubbing my hands together right now. This is going to be fun now. I'm going to get Googling every time you answer a question. We should probably give you a score at the end too, just to make it really stressful.
Yeah, let's do a score. Have to come up with a rating system first, right? I have to think this, right, about just completely going off topic. When I listen to shows or read magazines or whatever, and they give a rating, right, it's like 8 out of 10. And I'm like, 8 out of 10 what? And what does 8 mean? If you give everything an 8, then that's literally a 5, right? But then if it's a 5, it's just... sorry, a little rant over.
Someone should write an app for that. Yeah, absolutely.
Normalize all of your ratings.
So, Jamie, welcome to the .NET Core podcast. It's nice to have you on tonight.
It's great to be here.
I've been waiting to have you on to the .NET Core podcast for some time now. It's you wouldn't believe the number of people who've said to me, "You need to take Jamie on the .NET Core podcast." So it's great to have you. Now, I left the .NET space probably about 2 years ago now. So very early .NET Core days. So my knowledge of it is fairly limited, and the knowledge that I do have, or at least the experience that I do have in .NET Core, was of a very hazy and frustrating time in .NET Core's life. So, first of all, the burning question that I've had in the back of my mind is whatever happened with that CS Proj, like effectively packaged JSON stuff, right? Because I liked the JSON. I thought that was really great, and I didn't like the fact that it went back to the CS Proj. So what happened there? Why do you think they went back to CS Proj, or have they published why they went back that way? What's going on there?
Yeah, so for the people that don't know, pre V1 and V1 up to about just before V2 of V1.1 they dropped it. So very early days .NET Core, instead of using a CS Proj file or an FS Proj file or I don't know how you do VB. I guess VB proj, but instead of having a project, oh, well, there you go then. Instead of having a project file which was all XML, where you had to explicitly list all of the files that you wanted to compile and having all sorts of different feature flags and all that kind of stuff, instead of doing all of that, they did away with that, and you had a JSON file that just said, here are the dependencies. Go build the thing, right? You don't list any of the files to compile or anything like that. Greatly simplified everything. And everybody went, brilliant, because we actually hate XML, because everybody hates XML, right? Unless, of course, you're building some kind of enterprise level application and you're paid by the line of code that you write, then yeah, everyone hates XML. Even the people who designed XML, I'm sure, hate XML.
Yeah, we hate blanket statements at the .NET Core podcast. Yeah.
Exactly right. So JSON simplified everything. Let's do everything with a project JSON, which just lists the libraries you rely on and how basically a couple of things to do with how you're going to build it, but not all of the files. And that was great because at the time they were building the .NET Core tooling to match as much as they could the sort of the available Node tooling and like the Angular tooling and stuff like that. Let's use JSON and whatever we can everywhere, because JSON is kind of like an industry standard, right? And then, of course, somebody came along and said, but if .NET Core is going to be the future, that means that you're going to have to build two different versions of MS Build. So MS Build is the tool that Visual Studio uses behind the scenes, that the .NET Core compiler uses behind the scenes, the .NET compiler uses behind the scenes to build everything up. And they thought, well, we don't want to have to make two versions of everything because everything's got to be backwards compatible, right? Microsoft's big thing is backwards compatibility. There are apps that were written for Windows 3.1 that still have to run in the Windows 10 world. And so there's all sorts of hacks in the Windows code base and in the kernel that actually makes these things run. So we're going to have to support it. But if we have to support it, then that means we've got to make MS Build more complicated, and that's going to be difficult to do. And, I don't know whether you've ever built a compiler, but I didn't like building compilers because languages are hard, right? And parsing files based on file name and file contents, it all gets a bit wobbly. So what they ended up doing in the version 1.1 timeframe for the SDK and the runtime, they scrapped Project JSON, wrote a little migration tool, and actually went back to CSproj, but greatly simplified it. So now it just lists some metadata about your product, maybe the name, version number, a couple of build time tools, and then it lists all of your dependencies, and that's it. None of this, compile this file, then this file, then this file, then this file. There is actually an episode where Nick Craver, the episode of this podcast, right, where Nick Craver says that CSproj files are built for merge conflicts. And he's absolutely right. The original ones were built for merge conflicts. And it always seems to happen around a very specific set of lines. But yeah, I think it was a step. The whole thing was a step in the right direction. We've got a simplified CSproj. They tried out Project JSON. You can't blame them for trying, right? You can't have a go at someone for saying, well, you tried something and it wasn't going to work, but at least you tried it, right? Because it led to this simplification. So
you can have a go at them for taking away my favorite thing, though.
Well, favorite.
My favorite thing was the fact that they're finally doing everything in JSON, and they just took it away. I was it's like everything. What I liked about it, right, was the fact that it made things like it brought things together. You know what I mean? Like, because when we first started toying with .NET Core, I was in a house that had a MERN stack, and no, not a MERN stack. It was a MER with a MERD stack. Like we had .NET in the back end, but we had all the. Actually, it wasn't Express, was it? I've been in JavaScript too long. We had a .NET back end with a React front end. Is right. What happened, right? And so our stack kind of for a little while there, it was like everything kind of made it all felt comfortable. It was all it all kind of acted the same. And then when the CSproj files came back, it was like no. But if what you're saying is that it got simplified, well then, I guess that's a step in the right direction. Yeah, and in terms of the backwards compatibility, I think that's probably why I'm glad that I work in startups, because all that backward. Because the first thing that comes to my mind is why make it so far backwards compatible? how do you do anything good if you have to continue fighting the ghosts of badness past? I don't want to have to deal with that sort of stuff, and I don't have to in startups. But I guess at an enterprise level, I can see why that would be horrifying to think that your application would go out of style every 2 years.
Oh, definitely, yeah. It's something that may actually become a problem moving forward. When they move to .NET 5, which I guess we can talk about later, it's going to be a rolling 2-year long-term release. So 5 is the short-term release, 6 is the long-term release, 7 is the short-term, 8 is the long-term. So I get the feeling it's very JavaScript-y in the way that they're doing it.
Mm-hmm.
With all of like the Angulars and the Reacts of the world, the different version numbers tend to be this is long-term, that's short-term, this is long-term, that's short-term, which makes sense because then you can innovate in the short-term, right? Yeah.
The and that's the thing, right? Is that Microsoft they're so, I'm going to use a big word, duplicitous. I'm not sure if that's. I'm going to have to Google that later and find out whether I was smart or not.
Do I lose points if you're wrong there?
Like duplicitous in nature, I'm rolling with it. In the sense that on one hand they'll say, oh yeah, we need long-lasting support for all the stuff that we build, but then IE basically goes out of style every time they do a new version. But also, Microsoft V1s have a spotted past, in terms of... and that was one thing that I was dealing with when I was leaving the .NET space, was there was a lot of people who were going, should we go with .NET Core? Because I'm not sure how much it's going to change. I'm not sure whether I'm going to write a whole thing and then have to rewrite a whole thing next year. So that still very much exists in that space. And so how is that now with .NET Core? Is it like, can I write an enterprise app in .NET Core now? I guess is the shorter question.
Oh, most definitely. I've always said if you're doing something important, like an enterprise level app, wait for version 2. Because no matter what you're doing, everything is going to be wobbly until version 2 comes out. And that's not a shot at Microsoft, because the same thing happened. Like you look at Angular, right? AngularJS. You could argue that although AngularJS V1 existed for a long time, it was awfully wobbly. And then Angular 2 came out, and that was a little bit less wobbly, and we've slowly moved towards less and less wobbly. But then I guess you could probably say the same with React, because I've only ever used like vlatest of React, so I don't know what the early days were like. But the early days of everything are going to be a bit wobbly, right? Yeah,
I mean, we will disagree about the difference between Angular 1 and 2. 2 was 2 stank out loud. Like you could hear how bad that was. But yeah, no, the future versions of it were a lot better. But 2 was reaching. Version 2 was a version 1 of something new. I think that's why it was not as good as Angular 1. But yeah, anyway.
Yeah. And again, if you compare Angular 2 in that instance, then compare Angular 2 to Angular 3.
Yeah.
Rather Angular 4, because they skipped 3, didn't they? Was that the one they skipped? Because
I think they skipped 4. I don't know, but I'm not an Angular developer. Yeah,
I do know that they skipped one version because they wanted to keep all of their everything in line. Everything is version 2 until version 3 comes out, and then everything becomes a version 3. But someone had accidentally upgraded one of the libraries to version 3 or version 4 or whatever, and they had to skip an entire version to bring everything into line, which is hilarious. But also, open source. So
there's heaps of stories like that. In Angular 1, they released Angular 2 as a beta, but then Angular 1 was still in like widespread support. So whilst they were building 2, they had they weren't able to release major versions, because if they released them, it would end up being Angular 2, right? And so I'm not sure if there might have been 2. It was definitely 1, because we got stung by it. There was a minor version upgrade in Angular 1 that was actually a breaking change, and we got caught by the break whilst we were in the middle of building something. It's like because NPM didn't care. It was just like, yeah, well, it's not breaking, so whatever. It was a real nightmare.
I mean, the thing to take away from this is not that Angular is bad or .NET Core is bad or anything like that. It's just software is hard, right? And versioning software is even harder. Leave that to the geniuses to figure out.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a Vim. I'm slowly working my way towards Emacs at the moment, which is
cool.
an exciting new horizon for me to go down. But I've been a Vim user for a number of years at this point. And one of the biggest sort of like things about being a .NET developer who is also a Vim user is there is half of your stack that you can't. I mean, I could use Vim. There was a Vim plugin for Visual Studio that I hated because it didn't do everything that Vim did. But there wasn't a lot of options for a Vim user out there. Now that .NET Core is one of the big things about .NET Core is that it's cross-platform. Where anyone can develop anything, anytime on a .NET stack. Do you know how much more support there? Do I have to be in Visual Studio? And if I am in Visual Studio, am I able to make it more comfortable for me?
Well, I can't really talk for Visual Studio because I haven't used it in like 2 years.
Wow.
So, yeah, I know that it's gotten slightly better. 2019 was supposed to be better than 2017, but it's still a huge monolithic app, right? And it's still very slow, and it's still single-threaded, and it's still a 32-bit app, which means, it's very slow. And then if you install ReSharper or something like that, a bunch of plugins on top of it, it gets even slower. So, yeah, it's like the Swiss Army knife of development tools, right? It does 1,000,000,001 things that you will never need, but they're there, right? So it's like, on the one hand, it's ace because it has all of these tools you're never going to need. But on the other hand, you're never going to need them. So it's like,
it's a Swiss Army. It's a Swiss Army knife that doesn't have the tool you actually need at any point as well. Thus, ReSharper.
Yeah,
a Swiss Army knife that needs a Swiss Army knife on the side of it to make it usable.
That's it, right? But that's the interesting thing is that Visual Studio has slowly been integrating ReSharper-like features into, like, the Visual Studio team have slowly been integrating these features, like the easy find and replace, the refactoring tools, all of the squigglies for the suggestions and stuff like that. But yeah, I've not used Visual Studio in a very long time. My daily driver is actually a Linux distro, and I develop all of my stuff on this Linux distro. When I have to use Windows, maybe I'm working with a client that requires me to use Windows, I'll do that, but I'm still not using Visual Studio, right? I flip between VS Code and Rider. And VS Code, people say that it's an IDE, but it's essentially just a text editor, right? So it's not really one or the other.
Yeah, well, the majority of the stuff that like the plugins and stuff that I use for Vim and all that are actually like Vim script over the top of VS Code plugins. So it sounds like I might actually be able to make a decent go of it these days.
Oh, definitely. It's so a lot of time was actually spent on the .NET Core tooling the .NET Core CLI tooling and that kind of side of things rather than integrate it with Visual Studio. And that was largely because, for want of a better phrase, Microsoft wanted all of the Linux and Mac OS users to try out, to jump ship, to come over to the dark side, try and use our thing, right? And Linux users, Mac OS developers tend to like the CLI tools a lot more than the visual tools for one reason or another, right? You're going to spend $1,000 on a computer, you're not going to use the user interface it comes with, you're going to use the terminal. But whatever, right? So, yeah, they spent loads of time and effort on the CLI tools. And so, yeah, there are things like, one of my favorite ones is there's a CLI tool called .NET Watch, which will just watch your source code, and when you save, it will rebuild, right? Which is really useful. Or it can run your tests. So you hit save and it just instantly runs all of your unit tests, integration tests, that kind of thing. And you could potentially pair that up with Vim. I'm not brave enough yet to have used Vim or even Emacs or any of these wonderful tools. I don't want to say old school, but wonderful tools. One day.
Well, Emacs is newer, but yeah. Now, I mean, I try not to be too jaded when I think about Microsoft because they seem to have fought open source for so long, and then it almost feels like they've begrudgingly, embraced it. You know what I mean? It's like, oh well, if all you guys are just going to keep on doing your open source, then I guess we'll have to come and play. You know, like, and you can see that in ReSharper, because I've spoken with one of the guys from ReSharper at a meetup one time, and he was actually saying that the majority of the slow stuff that happens in ReSharper is because the VS Studio engine that they're trying, like the API that they're trying to integrate with, is just so slow and doesn't get any looking into, because they know that that's what ReSharper uses to do its stuff. And so rather than being like, hey, ReSharper's doing some great work out there, and they're helping our developers out, why don't we work on that API that is slowing their software down? We can make their software faster. Our developers will be happier, on and on it goes. Instead, they're like, no, we'll, I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll take all the good ideas they had and we'll put them in Visual Studio Native. So that way, we've got it, and then, whatever to ReSharper. So that whole experience really sort of jaded me. I think I'm now really trying to spend a lot of effort to undo, companies can change, right? It seems like some of the moves they're doing with GitHub and stuff are better. I hope they do good work with NPM. So
yeah, I mean, there's a quote from. So I heard it third hand, right? So I don't know how true this is, but I'm gonna have to name drop a couple of times to get this out. But Phil Hack once told me that Scott Hanselman once told him that Microsoft is like an oil tanker when it comes to open source. It's turning, but it's going to take a while. And I can totally understand that if that's the case, because the majority... I was talking to someone today where I was saying, it doesn't matter what operating system you use or what tools you use, because it's all the same now. As long as you're using your language, all of these tools and operating systems, it doesn't really matter. That's the whole point of containerization and stuff like that, because it doesn't matter what your underlying operating system is that your app is running on, because you can throw in this container which will give you a known state to start from, right? And, Microsoft, at the end of the day, they just want developers to use Azure, because that's where the money is. From now on, that's where the money is hosting and cloud and all of these wonderful technologies. Doesn't matter how you build your app. You build your app, do your thing, but host it with Microsoft or with Google, and they'll be happy with you because you're paying them loads of money, right?
Yeah, I mean, but that's just the thing, though, isn't it? It's like, Microsoft have a history of not wanting you to use, yeah, you can do this good thing, but it's got to have a Microsoft sticker on the front. You know what I mean? With the whole thing with Enterprise Service Bus, was that the thing? And that was already a pattern that was out there, and the guys at End Service Bus were already doing an open source version of it. But no, use ours, and it was garbage. It was not good. And instead, what they, they've got so much money and so much sway. What they could have done is said, hey, let's work together. Let's make something really cool together. And we can negotiate some form of. I don't know how the money works, but I feel like they're slowly starting to get towards that now. I feel like they're slowly starting to be the outcome is kind of what's important. And if we get a really good outcome and people are happy with that outcome, then we can try and monetize that as we go. But the only monetization model needs not to be, we'll use our stuff for nothing else. And that's where Apple's starting to fall apart as well, right?
Yeah.
I've said for years that Apple is headed for a big fall because they won't play nicely with anyone else. They insist on being this behemoth, and if you just sit there rattling away, it's you can only burn so many bridges before people are just going to be like, you know what, I don't want to pay $2,000 or £2,000 for a substandard hardware. For substandard hardware with great software, I can't be bothered with that anymore. I'm just going to go do something else, Anyway, we're way off topic at this point. And so I'm not sure how you normally run the .NET Core podcast, Jamie, but how I run it is a tight ship, and we must stay back on .NET Core, because that is what your listeners came here for. So So yeah, well, my next question was that as everything is like wholly cross-platform now, can a .NET developer work comfortably in Linux? It sounds like you kind of already answered that question, right? Earlier, you are already working on a Linux distro, right?
Yeah. The one thing that I can't do is Windows specific stuff, so like WinForms, WPF, that kind of stuff, or working with like Windows authentication. And for that, I just drop out to my Windows machine, or I'll fire up a VM and do it in that. Or I have actually in the past fired up a VM in Azure, or insert your cloud provider here. Fire up a VM, install the tools, do the 20 minutes worth of work, and then destroy the VM and carry on, right? Because it doesn't really matter, and it's cheap enough just to fire one up and spin it up and spin it back down again. As long as you actually shut it down and turn it off, then you may not get charged for it. But yeah, my daily driver is Pop! OS, which is based on Ubuntu, and I chose that one because it comes with all of the Steam stuff and Vulkan and Proton and all this kind of stuff for video games already installed, so I don't have to do anything. But
it's like a Windows box, because that's the only reason I have a Windows box in my house is gaming.
Yeah, pretty much. Side note that's not really related to the content of the podcast. There's nothing on my Steam account that I haven't been able to run on my Linux machine, on this Pop! OS Linux machine.
Wow.
And that includes like the recent remake of Resident Evil 2 and all that kind of stuff. It just works. The folks over at Valve are very smart in whatever they've done, whatever magic wizardry they've done, it just works, right?
Oh, so Pop! OS is Steam, is it? That's put out by Valve.
No, so Pop! OS is made by System 76, who make a lot of Linux hardware, and it's based on Ubuntu, but it has everything enabled from install to allow you to do like the Steam and Proton and Vulkan and all that kind of stuff, because you need Proton to do the Windows stuff and Vulkan to do very fast UI stuff, and it even has NVIDIA drivers already installed, because NVIDIA drivers are difficult on Linux. So that's already all set up for you out of the box, which is just genius. At least in my opinion, anyway. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, speaking of stuff that isn't .NET Core, as we have been for the last half an hour, tell me, WTF is Blazer?
Okay. So the short answer I always give to this is, imagine a world where you don't have to use JavaScript. Now, I know I'm already scaring you, right, because you're a JavaScript full-stack developer, but imagine a world where you don't have to do JavaScript to run stuff in the browser. I mean, you can already do that anyway. You can run, I think there's a way to run Python in the browser and Perl in the browser, but imagine, right, you can run .NET inside the browser. And it doesn't take forever to start. And that's essentially what it is, right? There's this new, new in that it's been around for like 3 or 4 years. There's new technology that's baked into all of the browsers called Webassembly, which is a way of creating bytecode for browsers, right? Because the way I always say is JavaScript was invented over 10 days and was used specifically for moving and manipulating text on a page. It wasn't really meant for doing all of the things in the browser. Yes.
Whoa. Okay. I'm not going to be responsible for this being perpetuated, right? Yes, it was created in 10 days, many, many, many years ago, and has now been iterated on by a group of peer-led, a peer-led committee to become the language it is today. Okay, so we're not no one's programming on that language from 20 odd years ago. No one's doing that. No more than we're all developing on .NET 1.0, right, or 0.1, right?
Yeah, it was unfair of me to make that comparison. Is what you're getting at.
Yeah.
Totally get it. But yeah, imagine you're not a JavaScript developer and you want to do front end stuff. Mm-hmm. Right? Or you have a huge team of .NET developers and you want to build a front end, and then suddenly someone has to go and learn Angular or React or Vue or Svelte or something, right? Well, what if you could just take all of that pre-existing knowledge and splat it into the front end, even if it's just temporarily, right? Just get that going, and then we'll hire someone who can turn that into JavaScript, right? Because that's the great thing about .NET. I've always seen it as this rapid application development model, right? Because our friend James always calls .NET pretend programming. Excuse me, because it is. It's just literally take this chunk of code, wire it into that chunk of code, wire it into that chunk of code. But you've got your app. All right, the wiring in may take a very long time, but you don't have to write the sockets. You don't have to write I/O. You don't have to write time scheduling. It's all pretty much all of the hard bits of actual computer science are taken care of for you. So that's great. But imagine you could do that in the browser, and that's what it does, right? WebAssembly is this idea of taking this idea of bytecode and putting it into the browser so that then you can write an app in Go and have a part of the app in Python and have a part of the app in, .NET, and then another part in JavaScript. You put it all through the same compiler and it spits out a WebAssembly binary that is all compiled into that WebAssembly code, right? And that's what Blazor is. It's taking the browser and Razor, this templating engine that we use for creating HTML pages on the server, and sort of mashing them together, throwing a cross-platform .NET runtime underneath it called Mono, which was the originally what was, you could think of it as .NET Core Beta, but it's not. Mono came out in the early 2000s and was basically a closed, what's called a black box re-implementation of .NET based on how the APIs worked. And that was created by Miguel de Icaza, who is an absolute genius of an engineer. But yeah, this Mono runtime, this .NET runtime is so small, you can load it into the browser over HTTP that you can go get me the DLL, and it comes in and it's like maybe 4 megabytes, 5 megabytes, and just runs. You've got your .NET sort of runtime ready, and then your app sits on top of that. You've got .NET inside the browser. And that, like I said earlier on, you don't need to worry about all of my people are .NET people. Now I've got to bring in the JavaScript person, and maybe there's going to be some conflicts because of the way that the different technologies work, or maybe we now need to pivot and all learn React or all learn Angular, and that's not a bad thing. Having to pivot and learn that is just, it will slow your development down, right?
So, but I mean, we don't live in a world where people don't know JavaScript as full stack developers, right? Like that. No, I'm honestly, let's have an open discourse on this. Like,
of course,
why is it attractive to stay in the same stack to be able to do all that stuff? Especially when you're saying it costs 5 megabytes across the wire to make it work. So what, like, what's the real driver there other than I don't want to have to retrain my people? Because really, you're going to have to retrain them in Blazor anyway, right? Like, if they don't know Blazor, they have to learn it. So what's up there?
So part of it is this idea of sharing the code, right? So your view models that you generate on the server can then be used inside of the browser, right? So it's the exact same code. So that makes it a little simpler. But there's also 2 hosting models for Blazor. There's server-side Blazor and client-side Blazor. Now, server-side Blazor used to be known as Razor Pages, but you could think of it as essentially ASP.NET MVC, right? You've got a bunch of Razor, which is the templating language. C# on the, or .NET rather, on the server fills in that per request and then generates the HTML and throws it out to the client. That's kind of, it's server-side generated pages, right? But the client-side one is where it all gets a bit interesting, right? You've got .NET code running on a client browser. You've got .NET code running on a server. And when the user hits a button on the client, let's say there's, order pizza button, right? You've filled in your form, you've chosen your toppings, you've put in your address and your credit card details, you hit order pizza. And in a traditional MVC app, you need to take all that data, send it off to the server, wait for the response, and then load the response, which would maybe be a different page, or maybe it would be some just kind of AJAX call. Whereas with Blazor client side, you push a button, it sends the request over, and instead of sending the whole page that returns back, the server knows the state of the page in that browser, changes it on the fly on the server, and just sends back literally the pixels that have changed, right? Swap this div for this div, done. That's it. So you don't have to actually go anywhere. So you have this real-time bidirectional communication with the server, and where the client and server can push data to each other over what's called Signal R at the same time, which
It's all
is fantastic,
socket-based,
right?
and-
Yeah, it's all socket space. Yeah,
And so it sounds like it's kind of like a hosted virtual DOM, like the virtual DOM as it used to be described in React, where it was kind of like, I've got this version of it and I've got the rendered version of it, and I only really want to change the parts that have actually changed rather than re-rendering the whole page.
Yeah, that's literally what they call it. They call it the virtual DOM. The server has a copy of the DOM, and based on the session ID and based on the connection. Now, the problem with that, of course, is you need a stable connection. If you've got people who are going out into the field, either quite literally a field or going into a warehouse or something, where they don't have connectivity, that client-side Blazor is no good.
If it's all run through SignalR, it still helps though, because if I recall correctly, SignalR has like a degraded functionality sort of thing where it does HTML long polling if it can't get sockets, and it tries a whole heap of different things. There's a few things, if I remember correctly, that it tries that no one ever has, but they just chance it. It's just like, well, maybe this will work,
Yeah, right. But then, of course, obviously, if your connection is dropped, then you no longer have, I'm talking about that bidirectional constant communication. That kind of falls over. But then as soon as you reconnect, you got that bidirectional communication. You can just push the button and your report is sent over, or you're then told to go over here or something. So it's kind of useful in that respect. And, for the people who, some people don't like the duck typing, right? Some people like static typing. Some people don't like to use TypeScript for whatever reason. You don't have to. You don't have to use .NET, but you can if you want. And I think the biggest problem with Blazor is that no one's come up with that killer app yet. Every framework, every library, every language has its killer app, right? And no one's done that for Blazor. But as soon as someone figures it out, that'll be the thing that makes everyone stand up and go, "Oh, wow, this can actually be pretty cool."
I think you won't know about the killer app from Blazor, because from the sounds of it, from like the sorts of apps that you're probably going to build with this, they're not going to be like on your iPhone, right? Like this is this really sounds like something where you would build like an enterprise level system or something. Like you would have something like I don't know, something that goes out with mobile mechanics or something like that. You know what I mean? Like something that's really widespread, but ultimately behind the scenes for the majority of the every person on the street.
Sure. The only thing that's sort of close to a killer app that I know of is I think it's called Diablo Blazer, that lets you run. As long as you have the original asset files, you can run Diablo inside of your browser, because all they've done is recompiled the binary to WebAssembly through Blazor, and then they've added this .NET layer that just goes, read the file from disk that you give me and feed it into the game engine. But then that's not even really Blazor. It's not, it's more WebAssembly. So yeah, I think you're right. I think because it's more of an enterprisey thing, I think we're never really going to see the killer app unless some enterprise goes, "Hey, we'll tell you how we did it," and hope that you don't break it.
So, I mean, we're using the magic word here. We've used it a few times here, the enterprise. So, what do you think? Has .NET Core made .NET more friendly for a hipster, a startup worker like me?
Well, I think it certainly has with the leap towards CLI tooling, right? If you're using Vim, if you're using... so like when I started working with .NET, it was back at university, and we didn't actually use Visual Studio for the first... because the first year of university was let's learn C# and .NET. And the first half of that year was, okay, so I'm going to teach you the command line for building your apps. And it was like you would be typing for minutes at a time and then hit return and find out that it didn't work, because you had to invoke the compiler and then pass it every single file in the chain to actually compile everything, right? So that's immediately gotten easy. You just literally, in your terminal, you open the directory with your code in, you just do .NET run, and it runs, right? And I can take that folder, put it on my Windows machine, run .NET run, and it runs. Take that same folder, put it on one of my Linux machines, .NET Run, and it runs. Take it over to my Mac, .NET Run, and it runs, right? So that's genius to me. It doesn't matter. Like I said earlier, it no longer matters what your underlying operating system is. If you're running Linux and you're pair programming with someone who's running Windows, you just go, here's the code, there's the command, run it, and it will just run. Or you can screen share and you can help out that way. So that makes it a little easier, right? And you have to remember that the original version of .NET was kind of built mainly for enterprise apps on an intranet. We're talking 2002 here, right? And so because of that, it was very geared towards Windows, very geared towards that visual way of building software. But the world has changed now, right? You still have those visual tools for building software, but it's less of I feel like it's unfair to say it's less of an enterprise level world, because there are lots more startups and lots of people who are rapidly innovating. But I feel like the enterprises are still doing that. They're just doing it behind closed doors.
Yeah, basically, just saying startup work isn't real work. I get it. I get it.
Yeah, right. What you do every day, Zach, it's not real work, says the guy who's not had any clients for a week. But so .NET itself, back in the day, .NET Framework was this huge hulking monolith of an entire framework, right? And as .NET Framework has evolved, and as Windows has evolved, Windows has become reliant on it, which means that they can't iterate on it fast, because as soon as they iterate on something, they've got 20 years of apps that are going to break, or they've got billions of devices that are going to break like that because they change something in the framework and Windows breaks, right? So the iteration on that has slowed all the way down to the point where they're now saying there's going to be no new versions of .NET Framework. There's going to be security patches and performance patches where they can, but the security will take priority, right? As long as Windows is supported, .NET Framework will be supported, because Windows requires .NET Framework to run. So as long as Microsoft is shipping Windows, then .NET Framework will be around and fully supported. But because Core is rewritten from the ground up to be completely modular, first of all, you can go, I want this bit of Core and that bit of Core, and you don't have to pull the whole thing in, right? And secondly, when they go, well, we've sped up this bit, that is maybe the JSON serializer or deserializer, that then speeds up everything else. You know, it has this huge knock-on effect that they can go, we'll speed up this one thing in absentia. We'll take this one part of it, take it away, work on it and bring it back, and it will just continue working, right? And, you know, you have to remember that if you look at ASP.NET MVC, back in the day on .NET Framework, you hit run and it would take upwards of 10 to 15 seconds for your web server to actually start. ASP.NET Core starts almost immediately. You do .NET Run and start sending requests to it, and it will start responding. It is because of that modularity. It's almost instantaneous.
Well, see, that was the thing that I was looking forward to, coming back to the .NET space. All that time to surf my social networks whilst things were compiling. You telling me I don't get that?
That's it, right? No more social networks for Zach. That's what I'm saying.
I just have to do my work now.
That's it, right?
So, yeah. Fair warning, Jamie. I'm going to skip over the next question. Okay. So we'll come back to it at the end. Okay. So, having spoken about, how a hipster like me might be interested in .NET Core, well, to give your listeners just a little bit of background about the sort of stack that I'm working in at Kudu, we use microservices. The microservices are all written in Node, but the fact that they're written in Node kind of doesn't matter that much, because the majority of them are written in Node. We've also got other parts of the system that like the CPU intensive parts, like the CPU intensive services, they're written in Go. And for all our data analysis, we use Python. We've got a couple of different languages in our stack, and each of those languages they're fine tuned to solve a certain problem. It's like, we need to do this thing. We want to do it really well. Let's pick the right tool for it. Let's make that tool work for us. So, with all that in mind, I guess you don't know my full stack, but where would .NET Core hypothetically fit into a stack? What's it good for?
Well, I mean, it can do pretty much anything. So some of the stuff that I've seen and worked on, some of the things I've seen, there's a video game called Age of Ascent, which is a space-based MMO along the lines of Elite Dangerous and what's that one that you pay for 3 months before you can actually start playing? Oh dear, I can't remember it now. But there's, you build up a ship and you go flying around and you destroy everyone in the universe. That's
Eve.
Entirely. That's the one. Thank you. Yeah, Eve Online, right? That's it. It's that, but it's in .NET and .NET Core. And the lead developer Ben Adams actually keeps making changes, keeps making pull requests to .NET Core to make it faster and better, because he pulls the latest version of the code, puts his game through it, and goes, "Oh, that could be better. I'll fix that and submit a pull request." So, so it's running this MMO, essentially. I don't think it's a MMORPG, but it's definitely an MMO. And then, so let's dial that back, right? Clifford Aegis, who is a wonderful person, he's making a project called the Handy Project, or rather it's been named the Handy Project, which is an IoT hand that he's 3D printed that runs .NET across the whole stack. He's got the individual servos are controlled by .NET on a microcontroller embedded into the ARM. He's got a Xamarin app that runs on Android and iOS for controlling the hand. He can also read servo readings from the connector to the young gentleman's arm as well. So you can run games, you can run life-altering, I don't think altering is the right word. Empowering hardware, right? I've just said then, you've got Xamarin, right? So you can make a mobile app. You don't have to use Swift and Kotlin or Java to make your app. You can use one code base if you need to. Microservices are great for use with .NET Core because it's so small. And when you hit build, it will go brilliant. I don't need all of this chaff that gets shipped with .NET Core to do with, say, XML. I'm picking on XML today, but we're not doing XML, so we won't include that, right? So then your binary is tiny, to the point where I think you can get an ASP.NET Core web server running on about 20 megabytes of hard drive space, which is amazing, I think, right? When you think that ASP.NET MVC required .NET Framework 4.x, which required Windows, right? And that's a 4, 5, maybe even 6 gigabyte install with all the security patches, with all of the software included, with IIS and all that kind of stuff. So it's tiny, right? And it can be just flung around anywhere. I've worked on all sorts of different web services, from blogs to e-commerce stuff. I've even done ASP.NET Core hosted JavaScript-based single-page applications, which is a bonkers set of words to throw together, but it kind of works still. So you have this, there's this JavaScript library that talks to Node on your behalf through ASP.NET Core, which is weird. You've got a single page application that's still posting back to the server, but whatever. .NET Core now has full support for machine learning through ML.NET. So you don't actually have to use Python anymore. You can say to .NET, go and figure this out for me. Here's my machine model. Here's my machine learning model. Here is my data. Go do whatever it is you need to do. And sometimes that means it's got to go up to some cloud service provider, but it will do all of that and stay in that library, in that language for you. And then the craziest one, I say crazy just because it's mental to think about this, right? The same code. You've got a Tizen TV, a Samsung branded TV, or a Samsung fridge. You could run that same code on those devices. Because .NET Core is the official programming language, in bunny quotes, of the Samsung Tizen range of home appliances.
So it can do everything. It's how you'd say that.
That's the that's the problem. It's because it's a general purpose thing. It can effectively do everything, but it's not going to be the same as. So my experience of doing, say, ML.NET is not the same as handwriting the Python code that runs all your data analysis, but it will get you 90% of the way there because maybe you're a .NET dev and you don't know Python, right?
Yeah, but I feel like you've skillfully sidestepped my question there. So let me ask it in a different way so that maybe we can get the answer that myself and your listeners were looking for. What's your favorite thing to do in .NET Core? Like, what's the thing that's like, man, this is sweet. This you couldn't do this like in any other language. Like, and I mean, not everything, okay? Because
Okay.
I get it. It can do everything. That's like a cool
That's
thing,
Mic
right?
drop.
That's like a cool thing that it can do, that it can let you do everything. But like, what's the thing where you're like, oh man, I'm glad I'm not doing this in another language. This is really cool.
So my personal favorite one is, I know you can do this in Node-based stuff. You can make global tools. So, in NPM, you could do npm install global, and then you can run, I don't know, Gatsby, and it will run the Gatsby tooling, right? The same, you could do a very similar thing in .NET, or at least .NET Core. You can create these global tools. And so what that is that's a single application, usually a console application, but because it's .NET Core, you can pull in whatever you need. If you need to communicate with the web, you pull in the parts of ASP.NET Core, allowing you to communicate with the web, right? So this, one of the things that I've built is, at the top of the show, I literally say, type in .NET new podcast, and there's sound of me typing, right? That is me actually scaffolding a new episode. I bring up my terminal, type in .NET space new space podcast, and it scaffolds everything I need for a new episode. It creates all of the show notes for me. It sets up everything in the recording software I use, all that kind of stuff, right? But then I've got another one that I use for when I'm sending audio to the editor. So inside baseball, we hit stop on this recording app. I get a bunch of WAV files, right? WAV files are massive, right? I got to send those over the wire. It might be 1.5 gigabytes just for our conversation. So I've written an app that converts all of that WAV data over into FLAC, which is, we're getting a bit technical, but that's a free open source lossless audio codec, right? So a 700 megabyte WAV file may drop to 115 megabytes. I then got to zip that up and email it across. Well, I can just type in converter into my terminal and type in podzip as one word, hit return. It will take everything in the directory where I've just run that, do all of what I've just said, and then email it out, right? And that's just a single console app that I just wrote. Now, yeah, you can do that in Node, but I like that I can do it in .NET, right?
So your favorite things about .NET are the things that you've built.
Yeah. But no,
have you at least open sourced them?
I've open sourced one of them. I do have another one that I use to set up an entire machine. So I buy a new laptop, or I rebuild my computer, reinstall the operating system, right? I can pull the code for this app and run it. I don't even need to pull the code. I've got a NuGet package, right? I run the NuGet package and it installs itself, then installs .NET Core, because it needs .NET Core for some stuff, and then it goes through and installs all the apps that I want automatically. It then sets a whole bunch of policies on the computer, and then sets up like even the desktop wallpaper, and then it goes, it's done. And this is like, I pull a file, run the file, and walk away. 20 minutes later, my computer's set up, right? I haven't open sourced that one because that's more of a businessy thing, but I've used that technique in the past when I was working in a sort of DevOpsy role to set everyone's machine up so they're all running at the same level.
I feel like I've really given your audience some pretty like deep secrets in this episode. If they listen all the way to the end, there seems to be some real cookies here. You know, like the fact that have you told them before that you did that typing thing is actually like a real thing that you do?
I think I've mentioned it once or twice, but I've never actually elaborated on it fully.
Yeah, first time they're hearing it.
That's it. But just to really quickly go back to that machine setup app, I can run that on my Linux, Windows, or Mac machines, and it detects the operating system. It's the same code. Detects the operating system, and then sets it up differently based on, oh, this is a Mac. Okay, so you need to install Homebrew and pull the apps that way. And I haven't had to rewrite it or recompile it. It's literally the same code, just pulled straight from NuGet or pulled straight from GitHub. It's amazing. But then you could do that with Node, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, I could, but that's fine. You're allowed to be excited by your language. I'll allow it. You know, that's okay. So, I mean, you know, let's keep that enthusiasm going. What are you most excited about what's coming up for Core? What should I be listening out for? And you know, because obviously after this, I'm going to be inspired to start writing all our services in .NET Core. What should I be looking out for?
Okay, so the biggest thing that's coming up is they're sort of converging. Is converging the right word? I'm going to use the word. I'm going to do what you did earlier on. I'm just going to own it, right?
Google
they're converging. Yeah. They're converging .NET Core and Mono. They're bringing these two technologies together. I kind of touched on Mono earlier on, but Mono is this open source black box re-implementation of .NET from the early 2000s, written entirely in C and C++, right? And so it's small, it's powerful, it's what powers Blazor, it's what powers Unity, it's what powers Xamarin. And people are saying, well, why do we need both, right? Why did both exist? If they're both doing the same thing, why do they both exist? So Microsoft have gone, good point. And that's their next step, is to merge these two together. And to the point where I think this is going on knowledge from like a year ago, the unit tests for Mono, when ran on the .NET Core code base, work perfectly and all pass. I mean, they may all just be assert true, but they all pass. And the unit tests for .NET Core all run perfectly on the Mono code base. There's a little bit of wiring up to do, but then by merging the two together, .NET Core is written in C#, Mono is written in C++, you get this small, fast, modular runtime that does all of your .NET things, right? So it's one .NET code base to rule them all. So .NET 5, .NET 6, .NET 7 is actually going to be a combination of Core and Mono. Small, fast, brilliant. And then on top of that, okay, so we've talked mainly about web stuff, but let's say I want to make not a console app, but some kind of visual desktop app. Well, .NET Core runs on Windows and Mac and Linuxes, right? I'll say Linuxes because Linux isn't really an operating system, it's more of a kernel. Yeah, right? Yeah. Linux, I like it.
Oh, no.
So
my Alexa thought I was saying Alexa. Sorry.
Oh, the world of connected devices. But because of that, because it runs on these three desktop environments, or rather with the Linuxes, there are multiple desktop environments, right? You've got GNOME, you've got KDE, you've got Wayland, you've got all sorts of different technology that's used to actually draw the windows. Depending on the technology you use, the different APIs are available for those windows. So what's really exciting about that for me, since .NET Core first came out, people would say, but how do I make WinForms on Linux? And you can't, right? All of that is embedded directly into Windows. But Microsoft have come out with a thing called MAUI that they showed off at Build this year. And that MAUI actually stands for Multi-Platform App UI. So they've ignored the P in multi-platform, but they've completely just used the UI bit. But whatever,
you've got to come up with a marketing term. Call it MAPOWI.
Yeah, MAPOWI, that would have been awesome. But this uses Xamarin Forms under the hood, and it is essentially just that. It's multi-platform user interface, right? Because people have been crying out for it since day one. How do I make my user interfaces multi-platform, and how do I make a Linux app that runs on Windows? Well, this is, in the next year, this is promising to do that. But there's already an open source, well, that's open source as well, but there's already a third-party open source offering for that called Uno platform, which does exactly the same thing, except it's based on XAML, right? So you can build up all of your apps in XAML or Xamarin or whatever and run them wherever you are. So that's really exciting to me. This cross-platform UI, it's never been a thing, right? Well, it has with like technologies like Qt, but then you have to pull hundreds of megabytes of dependencies just to display a message box, right? But Uno and MAUI make this totally simplified. And then, yeah, like I said, the convergence of .NET Core and Mono, making it small and brilliant, right? So with that, the brilliance of C++, that crazy, I can't really understand what this line of code is doing, but it's doing it really well. And you've also got the C# side from .NET Core, where you have things like spanft and iasync enumerable. So you have these wonderful high-level stuff coming from .NET Core, and this wonderful low-level stuff coming from Mono, and you're mixing it together, you're going to get an incredibly fast runtime with wonderful tooling that is just, it's wonderful.
Well, that's super interesting. Well, Jamie, thanks so much for coming on the .NET Core podcast. We'll have to see whether we can get you on for the next episode. That would be really great. I think if we could get you on, that would be awesome.
I'll have to check my schedule, but yeah. I'll try.
So that was
awesome,
fun.
Awesome. So, yeah, that was a ton of fun, Zach. Thanks for flipping the tables on me and interviewing me. I feel like I should do one of these every year. I did one last year, done one this year. Let's keep doing these. I'll just have to find more people who want to sit and talk to me. So thank you ever so much for wanting to sit and talk to me, I guess.
It was my pleasure. My pleasure.
Oh, awesome. So just real quick then, before we fully sign off, if people want to learn more about you and some of the work that you're doing, what's the best way to do that? Is it Twitter? Is it just shout out the window? Is it write it down on a piece of paper and throw it into the bin? What's the process?
I'm at most of the usual places. You can get me on Twitter. It's at Zaka the Hacker. My workplace Kudu is at Kudu HQ. We're actually hiring at the moment, so if you want to come work with this guy, then you can check that out. And there's also at Tabs and Spaces is the Twitter handle for the podcast that Jamie and I run, or you can check out tabsandspaces.io. That's just it's spelled how it sounds. tabsandspaces.io. And yeah, you can come and listen to Jamie and I riff for an hour once a month on different developer issues. So they've been really interesting. There've been some good things we've pulled apart. There's 6 hours worth of content at the moment. We've got monthly, hourly episodes.
The date of recording it
uploading. Yeah.
Yeah, it'll more than likely be about maybe 8 or 10 by the time it comes out. But yeah, definitely.
A full day's work of listening to me. Fantastic.
Yes. Yeah. Just think of all the life lessons you can learn by listening to Zach.
I mean, it might be more than none.
As long as it's trending upwards, that's good, right? It can't trend downwards, is what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, it can only go up from here. You can't unlearn life lessons from listening to me, I guess is what we're saying.
If you liked that, that's essentially Tabs and Spaces, right? But for an hour.
Yeah. Cool.
And obviously
right,
James is there too, right?
James hangs out. Yeah, he's there. Yeah. So thanks so much for having me, Jamie. It was I had a really great time. I felt like I learned a lot. I hope your audience did too.
Well, I hope so too. Otherwise, I've done a really terrible job. But thank you ever so much for being on the show, Zach. I really appreciate it. Thanks.
Cool. See ya.
That was my interview with Zach Braddy. Be sure to check out the show notes for a bunch of links to some of the stuff that we covered and a full transcription of the interview. The show notes, as always, can be found at .netcore.show, and there will be a link directly to them in your podcatcher. And don't forget to spread the word. Leave me a rating or review on your podcatcher of choice. Head over to .netcore.show/subscribe for ways to do that, and to come back next time for some more .NET Core goodness. See you again real soon. See you later, folks. .NET Core Podcast is a production of RJJ Software Limited.